In this Murders at Karlov Manor Draft Meta update, I'll be providing you with the most up-to-date information on the format so you can crush your next draft. First things first, the format news. And the big headline is Verdict on Play Boosters, and that is because there was a new type of booster pack introduced for this format with a new pack composition that had the chance for multiple rares and things like that, and I'm happy to report that this seems to have been a success. The draft format does not feel unbalanced, it doesn't feel like there's rares and bombs flying around everywhere, and overall it has been really fun, and I think the new design philosophy for commons in particular to make them all more playable has been a big hit and has made the gameplay quite fun. Moving on to some more gameplay-based headlines, we're going to be talking about the Green Cannonball. And by that, I mean all of these enablers for making a big splash. Topiary Panther, Nervous Gardener, They Went This Way, all at common rarity, means that it is very trivial to splash once you are in green, and there are quite a few good cards to splash. First of all, you have great rares like Izoni, Center of the Web, or Doppelgang. Basically any rare that has a single pip is pretty easy to splash, but also just great common removal like Galvanize is definitely worth splashing in your green decks if you have the fixing to support it, because it'll just up your card quality, and there is that fantastic fixing available at common. So keep an eye out for those green fixers. Moving on to the meta market section of this update, we're going to be kicking things off with some archetype rankings. At number 1 is Red-White Battalion Aggro. It just has a ton of really high card quality, great removal, and good aggressive threats. Next up is Green-White. It's kind of a go-wide disguise deck, but any deck that has green in this format can also be kind of a splashy deck. So I've had Green-White decks that splash blue and go into more late-game focus, that splash red and then just have a couple of extra removal spells and play more mid-rangey. But you can also have these kind of disguise cards and just go wide that way, but it can play as a very mid-rangey deck. It doesn't have to be pure aggro, but it's a nice strategy as well and one of my personal favorites. Next up is Blue-Green Collect Evidence. This is a nice little late game strategy that can just use your graveyard for value. Collect Evidence is a mechanic that rewards you for having a full graveyard and being able to just remove cards from your graveyard to give buffs to your other cards. And this blue-green strategy just plays good cards throughout the curve that then scale into the late game because of Collect Evidence. Next up is Blue-White Detectives. This is just a nice white aggressive mid-range deck that can get some clues to grind through the mid-game, but also can have some very, very powerful curve outs, and so it's a nice little synergy deck if you can get enough detectives together. Next up is Blue-Red Artifact Sacrifice. This is another nice strategy that just has some really powerful cards that are like not really usable in other decks because you have access to powerful not only blue-red cards, but also blue individually and red individually cards that mostly fit into this strategy, and so you can get some really powerful cards for your deck later than you could for other strategies. So blue-red, you want to have some clue generation and then some cards that can use clues in other ways than just sacrificing them to draw a card. Next up is Red-Green. It's a big disguise deck in that there are a lot of cards that you will play that flip for high disguise mana values, but this often plays out as a splashy deck where your red-green decks will splash another color for extra removal, or they'll splash another color for a particularly strong bomb rare, or things of that nature, and just leveraging strong green cards, strong red cards, a cohesive strategy. You can lean more aggressive with this, but you can also just scale into the late game ramp up and use big finishers as well. Next up is White-Black, a small disguise deck. This deck just leverages cards that care about creatures entering the battlefield with 2 power or less. There are a few of those synergy pieces, but the reason it's a little bit lower on the archetype rankings here is because that deck just tends to be a little bit chip away style versus just doing big things. So the games you win are a little bit closer a lot of the time, and you don't always have that like blowout, just absolutely crushing your opponent potential, though you can still have some really good curve outs and stuff. Next up is Red-Black Suspect Aggro. It feels to me like the format is a little bit like sometimes tempo based, and you need to be able to block with your cards sometimes, and so Suspect Aggro, if it gets put on the back foot, ends up being pretty weak because the cards can't block because they're suspects. If it is on the front foot, it can be absolutely terrifying and can leverage some nice aggressive cards that other decks don't really get to use that well, but you need to make sure that you are always on that front foot if you're playing the Suspect Aggro deck, because there are other fast decks that can play both sides of the ball a little bit better. Next up is Green-Black Graveyard Value. Some of these cards are just really hard to set up, especially because some of the Green-Black payoffs care about specifically exiling creatures from your graveyard, which means you just have a lot of setup to get your value from your cards that are supposed to be payoffs, whereas a lot of other color combinations don't have to do as much work to get benefits from their gold cards. If you can get the synergies together, it can be good, but it's a lot harder to enable. And then finally, Blue-black is a clue control deck. Just build this as a typical control deck. Removal spells, card draw. The problem is that blue and black have a little bit more of supportive roles in this format. I think they both have great cards available to them, but they both oftentimes are the supplement color. You're going to have some blue cards that are going to fit well into your strategy, but you don't want to really necessarily build a deck around them. And similarly with black, it has great removal spells, but you don't always have enough pieces to just build a great cohesive base black deck. And so blue-black control sometimes just suffers from the fact that you won't always have great basis colors because these are more support colors, and putting them together doesn't always give you all of the cards you need. Next up is the color rankings. And before I dive into the colors, I do want to give the caveat that first, all of the colors are playable. So don't view this as oh, you have to play this color, or oh, you can't play this color. More so view it as a tiebreaker if you have a close pick. And best color does not mean have to draft. Worst color does not mean avoid at all costs. First up is white. White just has fantastic commons. It can play aggressive game plans. It can play more controlling game plans. It has some really strong strategies and pairs well with the other colors. And so it comes in at number 1. Next up is green. This is a close top 3 in general. It can definitely vary by personal preference, but I like green at number 2 because I think that the splashing that it enables leads to some very powerful decks. If you have the mana fixing, you can play a lot of the powerful cards that you're going to open in your later packs, or even get past when other players aren't able to play them. And I also think that green just has a lot of really nice 2-for-1s at common, so it just grinds into the mid game very effectively. Next up is red. Red and green are very close. Red has very, very powerful cards individually as well. Oftentimes, I end up splashing red cards in my green deck because they're that good. Galvanize, which we showed earlier on the splashing section, is the sort of common that you can just splash into a green deck because it is very efficient. And I think that red has very, very powerful tools and could definitely be interchangeable with green if you are have that personal preference towards building more aggressive decks instead of more splashy mid-range decks. Next up is blue. Blue is a great support color in this format. It has a lot of cards that are good in very specific homes, but it doesn't have as much general just build a blue deck and have all of your blue cards work perfectly together. It just is a little bit not as deep as some of the other colors. More shallow, you could say, instead of less deep. But yeah, it just, blue has some good cards, but it's just a little bit not as good as a base color, and so it comes a little bit lower on the rankings. And then black comes in last place. It doesn't have as many 2-for-1s at common available as the other colors. It also doesn't have as much depth. It doesn't have as many powerful cards, even though it does have some really nice removal spells, some really powerful gold cards, some really good synergy pieces, but it just is a little bit weaker than the other colors, so it does come in at last place. Next up is the format speed, and I would classify this as a medium speed format. There are some very, very powerful aggressive decks, so the way you construct your deck will be influenced by the speed of the format, in that you want to make sure you have 2-drops if you can get them. You want to make sure you have early interaction or things like that. But I've played some incredibly grindy games in this format, very frequently actually, because there are so many decks that can stall the game out and then just start sacrificing clues. And so both decks are kind of just competing to see who can be the last one standing with cards in hand and effects on the board state. You can cast massive spells in this format. You can do some splashing. If you miss your 2-drop, you don't necessarily just die. A lot of this is influenced by the fact that disguise cards come down as 3-mana 2/2s a lot of the time, which are not the most aggressive threats. They're not like playing a 3-mana 3/3 that just hits harder and things of that nature. A lot of the combat tricks in this format are also a little bit overcosted because they come with a clue attached. So you'll be playing slightly more expensive combat tricks, which does influence and disrupt your curve a little bit, which gives your opponents time to actually deploy a game plan. Now, if you're playing against a fast red-white deck, you're going to maybe have to have some sideboard cards that give you a little bit of extra defensiveness. But I would say that this format has a nice breadth of very fast games, very slow grindy games, and everywhere in between. And I think that a lot of the best decks in this format are going to be able to just grind into the late game while also potentially having draws that curve out and destroy your opponents quickly. Moving on to some of Nicolai's sleeper picks. And first up is Vitu-Ghazi Inspector. This is a card that I did not expect to like at all. I looked at it, I saw a 2-mana 1/3 with reach, and I was like, this is not going to be very good. But I have found that in my green decks, especially because I'm often playing these splashier decks that go into the mid to late game, having that extra 2 life gain and a 2/4 flyer for 2 mana is the perfect mid-game tool to help stabilize. Because you don't want to play this on turn 2, you want to play the Vitu-Ghazi Inspector once you've gotten kind of to a potentially stabilization state. Maybe you're down to 7 life or something, but you've traded off some creatures, and so you can just have a turn where you maybe play a disguise card and Vitu-Ghazi Inspector with 5 mana and get to use the collect evidence part of this card, and then all of a sudden you've added a ton of defensive stats to the board, you have a reach creature, and you've gained some all-important life. It plays really well with Topiary Panther, because if you basic land cycling Topiary Panther, you now have a 6 mana value card that you can collect evidence with to get the Vitu-Ghazi Inspector rolling, and it also plays really well with specifically Undercover Crocodile as a disguise creature, because that card does have a mana value of 6. So you play your 3 mana disguise card, it trades off, and then all of a sudden your Vitu-Ghazi Inspector has that collect evidence available. This is one of the biggest swings with a collect evidence card, because you really don't want to be playing this as just a 2 mana 1/3. I don't even generally always play it on turn 2 if I have no other plays, because getting that extra life gain is really valuable, and a 2/4 is a much more significant body, though of course it is based on the specific situation. Next up we have Sanitation Automaton, another card that I didn't necessarily expect to like, but it actually has performed really well for me and has been a card that I'm relatively happy to play in my decks, which I didn't necessarily expect because it is a pretty not a super flashy card. Just a nice 2-drop that is actually pretty good against the disguise cards, because you can just trade off with a lot of the 2/2s that are running around, which means it has extra utility against your opponent's 3 mana plays a lot of the time. Though if you're trying to block with this in the late game, it's not going to be able to block the disguise creatures. This is more of an early roadblock, defensively speaking, rather than a permanent solution to trade with a disguise creature. But it also just works really well with collect evidence cards, because it can fuel your graveyard in the early turns and maybe get you to have an extra trigger from a card like Evidence Examiner. So overall, this is not the sort of card that you need to take super highly, but it is the sort of card that you might end up with a couple copies of, and you don't have to be afraid to play it, because it does like get the job done if you need an extra 2-drop, especially as a sideboard card against the more quick decks in the format. I also have this more summary style. I call this a draft cheat sheet if you want to have this to take to your drafts or to have up on your other monitor when you're drafting on Arena. But it just has the archetype ranks, some top commons as a little bit of a bonus, the color rankings, and the format speed that we discussed in this video. And there will be a way to download this for free linked in the description down below. But that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Leave hashtag #ManorMaster in the comment section if you did make it all the way till the end of this video and you enjoyed it. But that's going to do it for this one. I hope you have more fun in your next draft. Wishing you all the best, and I'll talk to you next time.